Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Licensed mental health professionals, we warmly invite you to join our Spring 2026 NARM Therapist Training, a live online immersion into the transformative power of the neuroaffective relational model. This advanced clinical training is designed specifically for those seeking to deepen their expertise in healing complex trauma while offering the accessibility of an online format. From January to August 2026, you'll be part of a supportive virtual community of learners integrating mindfulness and clinical expertise. Through 4 comprehensive modules, you'll gain specialized trauma-informed knowledge and skills to confidently and compassionately address the impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. Together, we'll explore how to support the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma using a neurobiologically informed approach that promotes post-traumatic growth. Embodying professional and personal growth, you'll become a catalyst for transformation in your practice and community. Enrollment is now open for licensed psychotherapists, counselors, social workers, psychologists, and other mental health professionals, as well as graduate trainees and interns working toward licensure. Visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com to learn more and secure your spot in this online training opportunity. And now for our interview. Dr. Abby Blakeslee is an internationally recognized expert in trauma healing and somatic psychology. She is known for integrating somatic experiencing with clinical research, psychodynamic therapy, attachment theory, and somatic bodywork in both her practice and teaching. Dr. Blakeslee conducted original research on the role of implicit memory in trauma recovery with a dissertation committee that included Dr. Daniel Siegel and trained extensively under Dr. Peter Levine. She holds a master's in counseling and depth psychology and a PhD in clinical and somatic psychology. As the founder of Implicit Psychotherapy, she teaches somatic psychology across the U.S. and internationally and offers consultation worldwide. Her work centers on how implicit memory can be harnessed to access the biology of healing and the essential self. Please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Abby Blakeslee. All right. Welcome, Dr. Abby Blakeslee. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's so good to have you. I mentioned before we pressed record that I've been really looking forward to this conversation. So we're just happy to have you join us. And as I always do, I'll ask the question, what would you like our listeners to come away with from our time together today?
I think in many ways, just the topic of this podcast, it really compels me, transforming trauma. We know that, trauma can be a gateway for transformation. And it's one of the things that I am passionate about. I know if you're here, you're passionate about it too. And one of the things that makes trauma so difficult to heal from is that it's not encoded in our conscious memory networks. So I've been really looking at some of the latest research and putting together some new and fresh approaches to looking at how is trauma stored and how can we reach it and transform it more effectively. So I am hoping that you'll leave with some theory and some new understanding and then some practical ideas of how to do that.
I love that. That sounds great. I'm excited. Well, I wonder, for any listeners that aren't familiar with your work, could you tell us, how you got into the field? What brought you to trauma work?
Well, that is a very long story of what brought me into trauma work, but I'd like to kind of move more into my pocket or my interest of research, which was back in about 1999. There were a lot of researchers that were talking about something called implicit memory. So, Daniel Siegel with interpersonal neurobiology was discussing it. Bessel van der Kolk was talking about it. And of course, Peter Levine, who's been a long-term mentor of mine with somatic experiencing. And they were saying that in order to heal trauma, we needed to access or to work with implicit memory. Now, being really interested in neuroscience, I knew that they had lifted that from neuroscience literature. So I went deep in, I did a deep dive, and I looked at some of the early research. Two researchers, Graf and Schachter, in 1987 came up with these original studies of knowing how and knowing how to do something or knowing what that is different. Most of the studies that they started with were with a man named HM. And HM was not able to lay down any short-term memory. So or people with amnesia, for example, they would really look at what were some of the learning networks that stayed true, and were there things that people were learning and actually able to retrieve, even though they didn't realize they were retrieving them, that were in a part of a different memory network. So, looking at all of those branches of implicit memory and my dissertation research, I started to look at what branches of implicit memory can we access through some kind of a process and which remain hidden to us. Because the interesting thing about implicit, so I'm just going to define it for a moment here, it's non-consciously encoded memory, and you don't realize you're remembering it when you're recalling it.
Wow. I think that when you first said it with the gentleman, what was his name?
So with HM,
Yeah, HM. Yeah.
uh
So when you were first talking about that, I was like, oh, this implicit. Anyway, I was just kind of landing in a deeper way as you're kind of letting me sit with that. So it's memory that we're bringing up that we're not necessarily conscious of, even when we're recalling it.
correct. And you don't have to pay attention to it when you're learning it as well. So this brought me into looking at some of the different, they call them branches of implicit memory. So the branches of implicit memory, I'll go through those quickly, and then we'll sort of talk about how that shows up with trauma. One is called procedural memory. In the early research, all of implicit memory was called procedural memory, but then they expanded it to the word implicit. So you'll see some people who learned about implicit memory a long time ago, they'll use procedural memory and implicit memory interchangeably. But they're actually, procedural is one arm of implicit. So procedural memory has to do with movement patterns, and habits. So, for example, when a baby is learning how to put a spoon into their mouth, right? They're super cute, right? They've got the spoon and they're wobbling all around and they're like sticking it in their eye, right? And they're getting it all over their bib, and then they drop it and start using their hands, or even taking the little spaghetti and then getting it into their mouth. These movements are things that we learn. We see other people doing them. That's one way that we learn. And then we also begin to encode on a motor level all of these different movement patterns. But when you're riding a bike or when you're feeding yourself, you're not thinking, now just to the right, now just to the left. I'm noticing I'm slightly out of balance. Now, you might if something kind of goes wrong, right? Then you have some error prediction and then you start to respond. So I've got to adjust, right? That happens sometimes. But most of the time, it's like autopilot. So this procedural movement is one of those things that we'll often see showing up in trauma and recovery. I'll come back to that. Another form is called priming. Emotional priming is one. And then there's also a lot of cognitive priming. I should mention there's some cognitive levels or perceptual levels also in procedural. Many of these cognitive pieces of implicit memory, you will never be able to access. It's things like learning, when you see letters and they're right side up, if one was upside down, your implicit procedural awareness would pop in there and say, that's not right. So it's processing things on a cognitive level, but it is more based on sort of shape and perception and less on the meaning of something.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So now we move into some of this priming. Now, priming is really interesting. I would like to study it more, but a lot of what we would call some of that implicit bias, which is very important to work with trauma, especially with collective trauma, are these, very quick emotional automatic assumptions made on prior experience. Now, the interesting thing about priming is a lot of that emotional learning happens underneath the conscious radar, sometimes at very kind of subliminal levels. So, when you go to the movie theater, it's actually illegal for them to flash pictures of Coca-Cola or popcorn at low levels underneath your consciousness, because if they did, you would probably go, oh, I'm suddenly really thirsty for Coca-Cola. I haven't had one in 20 years, but I really want a Coca-Cola. So it's the way that we're influenced by things that happen consistently underneath the conscious radar, but they often can create some very quick automatic assumptions about the world. And also, when it's on the emotional level, we'll have emotional constructs around things. So that's also quite important. The most important, I would say, would be associative memory. Now, associative memory, we know all about that because it's, conditioned and unconditioned responses. You could look at triggers. There's an emotional level of this. So things that we get paired together from a neuroscience standpoint, you could say what wires together, fires together, right? Synaptic strength. And this is true in trauma, right? There's something that happens, many things get paired to that. And then there's sort of a re-experiencing is one way to look at it, that we have these cues and our body responds as if, or brings back those survival patterns. So we have the emotional component, but we also have a motor component. And this is really important. A lot of the somatic therapies have brought this to the forefront, is that human beings, like animals, when there is a deep threat, they will go into a freeze response. Procedural motor, associative motor memory, take out the procedural. Associative motor memory is the freeze response.
Say that again. So
Yeah.
something happens. Say that again.
Yeah. So associative emotional would be any kind of emotion that gets paired to a trigger. Okay. It could be also positive and negative things. It's not only trauma, right? We want to have positive associations about things too. But when we're looking at trauma, those are the things that we want to start to pull apart, right? Or to resolve. There's a whole separate branch, and that is associative motor. And that is the freeze response. So, sadly, but this is part of the research, that they have a lot of research out of labs that show when there is a rat with a foot shocker, they'll have a buzzer and then they'll shock the rat. And when that happens, the rat will go into freeze. But then when they stop igniting that foot shock and they ring the buzzer, the rat goes into freeze. That is a motor response. It's a physiological motor response that gets paired to a certain kind of association. Okay. So I would say in many ways, it's one of the most important pieces is working with this associative memory network. There's two other branches. We don't use those as much. It's sensitization and habituation. Those are a little bit more on a sensory level, things that you are exposed to over long periods of time. You'll sort of reduce your reactivity to them in a habituated way. Things that are new to you, you're more sensitized to them. So, if you hear a bell and you're in a rock concert, you're not going to respond as much. And then you're in a quiet room and you ring the bell, you'll be sensitized to that sound. So all of that being said, those are very specific, right? Channels of experience. And my question was, can we begin to access them?
Hmm. Yeah, that's exciting. That's a great question. So you're saying in the 90s, late 90s, you were coming to this research from the 80s and getting curious about, okay, what else might this mean when especially when we're talking about trauma or integrating experiences?
Absolutely. And I would say even now, this level of detail of looking at implicit memory and its role in our lives is not really talked about, especially when we start to begin to think about strategies to help ourselves or help our clients heal. Um, One thing that we do find is, especially if we go into some of that associative emotional and the associative, anything that's emotional. So you get priming is in there too. Anything where there's movement that involves the nervous system. There's another pocket of research which is really exciting right now, and it's the field of interoception. Now, Bud Craig, Dr. Bud, the late Bud Craig, I'm very sad that he is no longer here. I was a great fan. The brilliant late Bud Craig started to study more about the insula, the insular cortex. And that is the place of the brain that will light up. So, light up meaning that there's blood flow, there's connectivity that's happening when we bring conscious awareness to a bodily sensation. Now, the nervous system speaks through sensations. When you're feeling charged up, when you're feeling relaxed, when you're feeling hungry, when you're feeling sleepy, most people, not all people, because not all people have access to sensing sensations, but many people can learn to become more aware of interoception. As they become aware of the sensations that interoception lights up, and they have an opportunity to do a couple of things. One is to be in contact with the shifting landscape of your sensory world. Because when you are, it starts to unfold, it starts to change. It's like, talk about like watching weather. You know, you're standing and you're looking out over some plains with the grass blowing, and there's some clouds overhead, and the clouds are moving through. It's a little bit rainy, but then you see the clouds beginning to shift and break, and some gentle sunlight starts to reflect off of the grass. And you start to see shadows and light. The patterns of the wind begin to change. The temperature begins to shift. Maybe there's some birds that fly over. This is very similar as we sit with our inner landscape. I feel warmth in my chest. It starts to spread to the edges of my shoulders. I begin to feel a little bit of hardness in my belly. But as I pay attention to that, it starts to spread and soften and widen into the quality of like a net or some kind of a mesh. And as I sit with that, I begin to think about some different colors. A peach color comes to mind. And as that happens, then I begin to feel a little bit more connected to the center, and the feeling of the net is now soft again. So that was just an example of the kind of interoceptive experiences that as we follow them, they shift. Research calls it somatic reprisal.
Hmm. Okay. I never knew there was a name for that. As you were talking, I mean, I was feeling into it too. I was noticing like different sensations in my body, and I appreciate you giving language to that. It's really helpful.
And that's what we hopefully will begin to learn to teach our clients, and to also be connected to within ourselves, right? To work with our own trauma or secondary trauma, that inner landscape, and practicing can be very helpful. Now, remember with trauma, this isn't always a straightforward process, because when people begin to drop into their interoceptive awareness, there's a lot of survival physiology. There's a lot of emotional pain. There can be a lot of numbness that was very important at that time. And so we want to very gently begin to touch into places that are more tolerable and spend time expanding a little bit of awareness there. They can come back out again into the room, look around, look at you. But that sort of back and forth over time quality. And if you practice some of this work, it's also really focused on, and this is also important with implicit memory, new learning and implicit memory. So I know there's a lot of talk about, the resolution of the past. My focus is a bit more on, can we give the person, through implicit learning, a new memory now? And that new memory then becomes part of that automatic template that gets pulled on in the future. And we need to build that. We need to build these experiences over time, right? And kind of lay that is going to be the primary recall that becomes the new neural connection for the platform for a transformed life.
I'm just holding in this moment, like thinking of all the applications, all of the, that this would be really important for. And I'm thinking of, models that are out there that like maybe clinicians are already weaving this kind of knowledge into their work, but I could see the benefit for sure. Just a few that I'm thinking of. So
I love that you brought that up, Emily, because when I was building this model, I really didn't want it to be, in a way, an exclusive model, if that makes sense. It belongs everywhere. It already is being used. So if we think about new learning in procedural memory, when you've had a client that's had a boundary breach, you can sit and talk about the emotions, how painful it was, right? But actually have them, if they're willing to, stand up, feel the space around them. They might even put a string around themselves and make one of those statements or yarn, right? This is my boundary. No one may enter without my permission. Push and kick around the boundary. Feel into it. You as a clinician can move, from one side to another side with permission, or forward or back. And then they can sense to feel when something comes up, and they can reassert the feeling of their space. That's one an example, we would call it more experiential, but I'm going to reframe that to, it is new learning in implicit memory, because they're exerting a boundary now. They couldn't then, but they can now. And the next time something potentially concerning comes up, they're going to remember that experience with you as the first potential. Or we might need to practice it multiple times, because, if you have where there's multiple boundary ruptures, one exercise may not be the thing that begins to shift that. But if they have repetitive experiences of new learning, then we change that future prediction. We change that future in a way, what is autonomically and automatically grabbed, which brings a feeling of confidence that the trauma isn't past, that they've moved forward. I mean, if we look at interoception, both with some of that emotional priming, and then we also look into some of those associations, and we start to have we call it embodied emotional cognition. So we can feel more of our emotions. We can create a container internally where we expand and begin to notice the sensations. Emotion is a complex web of sensation, right? And for some people, they need to increase their ability to feel a range of emotion because they're numb, or they were punished, or there's fear that's connected, right? To feeling rightful anger, or to feeling sad. There's this layer of fear that needs to be worked through. And then to be able to increase their ability to feel it and to hold it and to know it. And then hopefully to be able to respond with others and in connection with others, to have a more rich and meaningful emotional life. And others need to decrease some of the intensity of the emotion, right? So we need to increase sometimes, but we also might need to decrease. And through a lot of the interoceptive awareness, there are great tools to begin to recognize how to be in contact with it first, right? And then we have choice points of where might we direct some of our awareness in order to engage that implicit emotional learning.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just really appreciating how you're framing this and also thinking, of my own personal work, like those moments that you kind of described where it's like suddenly there's other options on the table. Whereas before I maybe wasn't in contact with that. There was just kind of one way that things had gone. And now I'm in a new situation. And now, oh, we've opened up this whole other way of like experiencing it. And I'm just really appreciating the way that you're describing that and how our clients can experience that. Super cool.
Thank you. I love it, as you can tell.
Yeah. It's awesome. Yeah. So I'm curious, can you keep following this thread? Like what, so you've talked about, let's see, if we were to sort of give an outline, you've talked about there's implicit memory, there's all these different can you sort of lay that out for us again, the language?
Yeah. So we have all the different branches of the implicit memory. And in this approach, this implicit psychotherapy approach, we're going to be looking to help our clients have an experience in the present moment with us where they're having a new learning moment, where they're going to encode this new learning. You can think of it often from a relational standpoint, we're going to be leaning into moments of repair. What didn't happen before, but what's happening now. So that kind of level of attachment and attunement between you and the client, or in their memory, or in it could happen in the image channel, right? They might be having an image of being connected to a younger self, and there's an attachment piece that's happening there, right? I also, we talked about emotions. We talked about increasing or decreasing some of the intensity of that. One of the things that I haven't discussed yet is in, some of this approach where we start to look at the nervous system's response to a traumatic, a real, or an imagined traumatic event. And, many of the different approaches that look at this, we talk about the threat response cycle. And that happens very much in that, early instinctual level. You're pulling up some of those primitive reflexes that you even had in utero. A lot of learned experience, a lot of evolutionary experience goes into that. But we have things like a startle response, right? A wide and then a defensive orienting, a narrowing of a perceptual orienting response. We have the potential to vocalize, right? If it's more of a social threat. We have moving into more of like the more active. It would be a fight, moving towards, right? Engaging to defend, and a flight. Flight isn't only running away, but it's anything that retracts us or pulls us away from the threat. So if somebody just tightens backwards, right? Or twists to the side, we would look at that as a flight response, right? A moving away response. Then now we're moving into that motor. Associative motor is going to be all along the lines of a rigid freeze response or a collapsed freeze response. Now, once a threat is over, or it's perceived to be over, that takes time. And for humans in particular, it takes a quality of support, right? Time and possibly relational support somewhere along the way. That person will come out of that freeze response, or they'll relax or release the stress hormones, the catecholamines and all of the cortisol and things if they pumped into more of one of those higher charged active defenses. Okay. And so we have this sort of autonomic sequence where we move out of those survival states and we come back to kind of a broader level of the here and now, where we have activation and settling cycles. There's sympathetic or parasympathetic or charge or relaxation. You can think of it, energy and relaxation, in a lot of different terms, right? But we're not finding ourselves in those highly charged states, and we're not finding ourselves in those shut down places. Certainly not for long periods of time, and also not always paired to the same kind of information that was similar to the past. That's where then we get a lot of this sort of stuckness, right? And people talk about memory processing. But if we look at it through the lens of implicit memory, we're going to, again, begin to flow in here through this opportunity to connect to the nervous system, mostly or sometimes through interoception, through procedural movement. Are there movements that are coming forward as the person feels into this implicit memory right here and now? Kind of what is it saying? What are they feeling? Is that interoception shifting? Is it moving? Is it changing? Are those survival states releasing and reorganizing? Because often they do. Or are there movements that are being generated from that protection plan that the person can do now? They can move back, they can twist, right? And all of this implicit memory that's going twist, twist, move, move, they do it. And then it goes, that is the new memory now. I can do this. This is my feeling. I want to move backwards, and I moved backwards. And that becomes the new memory. So that's where it's so important to begin to engage, via interoception. And that's part of the unfolding language of the healing trauma process. And I like to think of it, we talk about the biology of trauma. I've started to think about that biology of recovery, right? And new learning and implicit memory to really access that biology of recovery. So that becomes that platform that we're moving forward from.
I love that. And as you're saying, this idea of like this can always be like integrated, layered in with whatever model someone is using, this awareness, this way of working. Sounds like it's really, there's a lot of flexibility there in terms of how clinicians are utilizing it.
So my invitation would be to everyone here, where are you seeing implicit memory at play in the office? Right. So right now you can't see Emily, but Emily is nodding, right? Mm-hmm. You can hear the mm-hms. So you learned how to nod a long time ago. Interestingly, too, maybe your nod is similar to one of your best friends or somebody in your family. We're also influenced by all of these moments unconsciously that we pick up from people or places or things that have happened. Maybe even one of our nods is similar to a great grandmother that we've never met, right? So we're picking up all of these sort of threads of experience. Now, this is a pleasant association, the nod and the, feeling of kind of there's a connection that's happening in that nod, right? But if we start to look at what can be paired more with the trauma, you would look at what is the movement? What is the interoception underneath that? Is there survival physiology at play? How is the nervous system speaking? What is alive? What is shut down, right? In someone's body, in someone's awareness. And is there this opportunity? Anytime there's an opportunity to follow that, to see if there's an unfolding on the other side, that reprisal opportunity by staying there long enough for it to change, long enough for it to transform. Now, I do want to mention that when you're with some of these difficult trauma experiences, there's a few things that we're really looking for. And I want to lean into one in particular, because in my current training, the implicit psychotherapy training that I'm developing, this is going to be a really big piece of it, which is working with anticipation. Okay, I'm going to use that word, the anticipation of what might happen, or the anticipation of the thing that happened before is going to happen again. There is a sensation of anticipation. For many people, that also would be the sensation of fear arousal. I'm going to call it fear arousal because there's usually a quality of charge to it. Now, people will constrict around fear arousal or they'll shut down. But we ultimately, if we can get to the fear arousal itself or the sensations of the anticipation of the it's gonna again. And in a way, you're trying not to work with all of the guarding of what happens around that particular feeling. And if you can take time to allow that to release, stay with it, there's usually like a charge to it. Tingling, shaking, trembling, heat, a vibration. It could be even just a feeling of like waves. Most of the time, there's energetic, right, movement in it. It doesn't usually go from constriction just to relaxation. There's some kind of worry, concern, right? Some energy that's there to plan for the bad thing that is about to happen again. So I just want to offer that to you. It's a small thing, but it's a very effective. If you can help someone, if they get scared of the fear, I'll say, it's fine. We can move away from it. But no, look around the room. Is there anything bad happening right now? No. Anything you need to be scared about right now? No. So this is an old signal that is in a high charge. Can you just call it your charge? Can you call it my sympathetic nervous system is charged up right now? And stay with the quality of the sensation. If they need, they can feel down into their legs, maybe wiggle a little bit, feel their back, right? Enough just to be here and to see if I'll say, stay with it for maybe a minute and let's see if it starts to change on its own. Yeah. And most of the time, 90% of the time, it will start to release. It will start to reduce. And the person begins to, that whole anticipatory layer is such a big piece of in that implicit memory. It keeps getting recalled over and over again. And then there's sort of counter defenses that are happening, whether they're relational or behavioral or emotional, right? Or trying to mediate that through any kind of external attempt at regulation, right? Or helping the situation. So this would be an easy but really helpful gift in working with that implicit memory piece.
Yeah. I'm so appreciating how you're bringing this in. And of course, my brain always goes to, so you said 9 times out of 10, it will reduce. It will kind of, what do you do if it doesn't? The 10th, person, how do you support them in that moment?
There's a lot of different ways that you can support them. One is to say, wow, it looks like there's a lot of energy that's here. And I think right now, probably the best thing to do is we're going to acknowledge it like a scared child. Yeah. We're going to acknowledge it and we're going to find some way to help you to self-soothe. So it could be any of the self-soothing or the regulation skills or tools that you've worked with the person before. It could be looking around the room. It could be naming different colors that they see. It could be putting a hand on their chest. It could be tapping. It could be sighing, making some sort of a sound that helps, like a vagus nerve exercise. It could be feeling your presence. Moving can often help when there's a high level of charge. And sometimes even just doing that will allow it to begin to disperse, maybe without quite as much focus. But then they also feel some kind of sense of, wow, I was in that high state of that anticipation or that level of fear. And then I was able to move away from it. I was able to shift enough. And that can also be very empowering for people. They don't feel like they have to get swept up into it. But if you engage it, you want to move through it, with it and through it. And so that new learning template can happen. And the wonderful thing is that a lot of the time, with time and with this new situation where you have that, we call it the neuroception of safety, or a relative pocket of safety, or the secure attachment, or the earned secure attachment between you and the client, that there is this sort of this new opportunity for that learning to happen. And then I often will talk to someone, because this is if you read some of what I like to go towards, is that we're also beginning to look at what is the person's essential self. Sometimes we can even look at it like, what are the parts of you that the trauma can't touch? What are parts of you, things that you do or that you've done that it could be something that's outer, right? So if somebody likes paddleboarding, for example, or somebody likes walking, whether it's around a neighborhood or it's somewhere where there are trees, you could say that they're a person that likes to be connected to the world. That's something that is deep inside their essential self. If it's somebody who walks around the neighborhood and they chat with people, that is a person where relationship is important to them. There's something that is essential, right? Or maybe showing care. So that person is showing care, but they're a caring person. So the more we can bring that quality of the view of the essential self, it's sort of also often underneath that developmental wounding or the developmental trauma. Yeah. It's either something that couldn't be removed or it could be something that they could reconnect to because they remember that it was a spark, right? And somehow that as they connect and they can feel into it, and this is where we want to increase interoception. We're going back to that implicit, the emotional quality of it in the interoception, in the here and now, so that it spreads out into, I would say, that non-conscious knowing aspect. So it's not just thinking about it, it's actually experiencing it and broadening and increasing that input, right, on the implicit level.
Yeah. So would your language be that you're helping pair that new experience with these resources? I'm not sure how else would you talk about it?
Yeah. I'm hoping to expand the conversation from resources. Although connecting to the essential self is an ultimate resource. So if we use a resource, Peter Levine talks about a resource, what makes you feel more like yourself? Other therapies, we could look at something that's external, right? If I look around, I see things that are important to me, right? Those are resources. There are internal resources, maybe a meditation practice or a way that you learn how to focus on yourself. So they're both internal and external resources. Yeah. This essential self it's getting to part of the core of the unique light that we each shine in the world. I think it is something that when there's a lot of trauma, because of the survival physiology and all of that, right? The pairing that begins to get replayed, certainly in that, or I would say that we begin to access in the implicit circuitry. The connection to that is more diminished. Or we're paying more attention to our survival than increasing our essential nature. Right. When we're focused on survival, that really takes all of our organism's time and energy. So although I often will work with all of this survival physiology, we're working with the embodied cognition and emotion, we're working with interoception, coming into those qualities of personhood, of being, quieting down, finding them. Where are they in that person's life now? And how do we expand them? Where were they before? And maybe they were lost or they're less connected. How do we begin to find more of the essential quality than the doing of? So let's say that somebody really loved doing something, but through an accident, they're no longer able to do that. Okay, so they loved marathon running, but through an accident, they can no longer run, or they have autoimmune and physical pain. But what was it around that the person loved? Maybe they loved the challenge of it. Maybe they loved like the smell of the air. Maybe they loved some of that feeling of the celebration. So, but you could look at that and unpair it to the doing of, and then connect it to the being of or the nature of, and then look to expand the nature of that within them without needing the external. Increase that internal feeling through the interoception, through the embodied emotion. And that begins to really move people also past trauma.
Yeah. This is so rich. This is so valuable. And I'm just thinking about how what you're describing to me, again, I'll just speak from my own experience. Like, I'm just thinking about the agency that this opens up for folks. So if someone, they're no longer able to run marathons, but you're helping them connect to all these elements of their experience, and how else can you create that? Like, where else could you be with that sort of experience? That's just super cool. I really love that. Appreciate what you're sharing here.
Yeah, it's like a blossom that opens from within. And sometimes, it's sort of, it's still emerging, or it's sort of, it's been tightly closed for a long time. But let's say, that person who loved the excitement of running, I am a person who loves excitement, right? I am a person who values excitement. And then where are those moments where there's some more excitement, where and it doesn't have to be the same, because the excitement of a marathon is going to be very unique. It could be, where do I feel some of that similarity? There's that excitement of something from the past, but where's the beginning of something that even I feel slightly interested? That could be the place where people start to open and connect into some of their essential nature. And then we want to, again, increase that quality and feeling from the inside. This works particularly well also, with shock trauma for sure, but also developmental trauma, right? Where there are a lot of those little T misses, along the timeline. It was more, pervasive or happened over long periods of time. When we get to some of that essence, we can, I'd say, rapidly begin to access the source. I like to think about that word source as well. So let's zoom out a little bit more in the implicit learning. What are we decreasing? What are we increasing? Okay. And so, but the thing that you're mostly decreasing is some of that survival, right? If somebody has a survival, and we're doing that through the interoception and through movement, from a developmental standpoint, where the repair, those moments of attunement, it could be an experience of rupture and repair, and rupture and repair, moving towards a more secure relationship with you. But that secure relationship also happens inside of the person towards themselves. A rupture and a repair. A rupture we could look at that as some of this survival, implicit adaptation, right? And they go, I'm feeling all of this, all of this distrust, all of this clenching, all of this overwhelm, all of this fear, right? And then them going, there's part of this feeling of the rupture. And they join through their conscious attention like a good attachment figure. And they stay with that feeling long enough for it to change. They stay with it with comfort. They stay with it with compassion, or they stay with it with just presence, right? And that's another really key piece. I often think of this as sort of like the earned secure attachment also happens within ourselves, to ourselves. And that's part of spending time in some of that implicit memory where the trauma can be encoded. We need to move into it in order to have that new learning to be able to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, because I'm just thinking of so many folks, who experience this more chronic, like developmental trauma, and they've had to disconnect from themselves to be in connection with caregiver or someone else. I just am really feeling into how, like, the value here that you're bringing, like being able to create that, earn secure attachment. I think that was the phrase that you used with themselves. How valuable that is. Um, vital, vital.
Yeah, it's essential. And in some ways, um, it's part, I've talked to Deb Dana about this many times. It would be some of what that idea of the social engagement that we're often trying to bring people into social engagement, into social engagement, into social engagement as a pathway towards healing. But a lot of the time, especially in some of my work, bringing them more into the secure earn secure attachment within themselves in order to move through some level of survival, then that is the gateway that brings them out into social connection. And the social connection isn't the thing that is the bridge that will help them necessarily to be able to do that. I'm not saying that sometimes it can't be incredibly helpful, right? And for some people, that is the bridge. But, I've often looked at that model and some of the ways that it's taught. And I think that actually now polyvagal theory has moved a little bit more and integrated more interoception and more around working in the sympathetic. But certainly we want to pay attention to how someone is paying attention to themselves. Yeah, that's also very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, because you're bringing in the curiosity piece, and when someone's sitting in front of us and we're noticing how they're relating to themselves and how they're paying attention or not paying attention to themselves, like there's so much information there.
Yeah. And it's interesting because sometimes people will start paying attention to their interoception, and then the interoception hides. Like it's like, hey, what is the quality of your attention? And they're looking for it. I have to find this, right? It's like a demanding attention. Or it could be afraid. I'm afraid of what I'm going to find. Really nervous about this. I don't know. I'm incredibly tentative. And so if you can help people to explore qualities of attention, and that would take longer than I have to map out, because I've been doing some research into that. What are some of the different qualities of attention that people can have that facilitate new learning and implicit memory? Um, but I'm just going to offer to you, get curious and see if you can guide them to have some more of either the neutral to compassionate. Those tend to be very helpful. Neutral, you just don't get in the way. You're just sort of bird's eye view. You're looking at it. And then the other one is going to be with more love and more understanding.
Mhm. Mhm. Abby, this has been so rich, and I'm mindful of the time. I want to check in with you. I feel like again, you could share with us probably all day long because you've done all this research and this really rich work. But I want to, just ask you: is there anything else around this that you feel like you really want our listeners to come away with?
I would like you all to continue as you're doing to learn and grow and bring as many of these eclectic approaches into your work. I heard from Zach Taylor at Psychotherapy Networker, because I presented there for many years now, that, 20 years ago, certainly, maybe 15 even, when you were an eclectic therapist, that was seen as eccentric. And now everybody wants to be an eclectic therapist because we're collecting things. And that's what I like about this model, is that you all are already doing this work. But there is a sense of a reframe of how do I access this, particularly in those non-consciously encoded networks, through movement, through interoception, awareness of bodily sensation, through emotional embodied emotion, right? The knowing thereof, the acting upon thereof, and creating these moments of repair where they get to do it differently with you. And they get to move through, they get to process that implicit memory so that something different emerges. Take time when it emerges for them. I would also say I have a dear colleague of mine, Kathy Kane, she says, hit the save button. Go on to the next trauma piece. Don't, say, this is really important. You're starting to feel better. You can breathe more deeply. Can you take time to be in this a little longer before we go anywhere else? We want you to feel better, these moments of betterness. And I would say, and I do say to my clients, because this is what we want to be pulled from that non-conscious program next time. And you'll see it over and over as you do this work, that sometimes it's just a few sessions, sometimes it's long-term work, but you'll start to see that their lives begin to be transformed. And more of that essential self will emerge on its own. And then you increase the synaptic valence of that. You increase the implicit learning as people are in it with you. So that becomes more of this sort of part of their ongoing identity that is just right there, right? It's the wellspring. So I get really excited. It's an honor to come here and to be part of this. I just feel so encouraged by all of the work that we're doing in the world.
We're so happy to have you, and just so grateful to learn more about the work that you're doing. And I this was such a rich conversation, and I know I learned things. I'm sure our listeners will be happy to be in contact with your work as well. So I wonder if you could share with us, where can folks find you in the world and the work that you're doing? And I know you've got trainings out there and you've got a lot of projects that you're involved with. Where can folks access that?
So you can come onto my primary website, which is abbyblakeslee.com. I have implicitpsychotherapy.com is in progress right now. We will be launching within the year a new program on there, which is, I can't tell you how excited I am. It's going to be interactive and it's going to have a whole bunch of new and interesting content. And then I also have another one that I'm launching called Embodiment Exercises. This will be for you. It will be for your clients. It's kind of like my hopefully something that will help everyone in the world who want to feel more embodied. So that's embodimentexercises.com. Both implicit psychotherapy and embodiment exercises are currently under construction. So you'll see something that's there, but pop back in, towards the end of 2025, we'll have them up and running. And I'd be really thrilled to share a lot more of my work with you. If you go to abbyblakeslee.com, you'll find articles, some of my research. You'll find other trainings that I'm doing as well. So that's sort of like the one-stop place to gather information on some of the projects that I'm passionate about.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. And I'm excited to be watching and seeing all these things that are developing. And we'd love to have you back because I know there's so much more that we could get into and explore. And again, just really appreciating the work that you're doing in the world. Thank you for taking the time to be with us.
You're welcome. A pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode.
To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. As a mental health professional, your commitment to healing and growth inspires us. We at the Complex Trauma Training Center are committed to supporting you in your well-being and success. That's why we are honored to invite you to our Space Program 2026, an inner development program of support and self-discovery for therapists on the personal, interpersonal, and transpersonal levels. Running over 6 online sessions in 2026, this interactive experiential learning program is designed to support self-care and self-discovery for therapists exploring internally, relationally, and transpersonally. CTTC faculty will welcome you into a professional community of therapists that are seeking to create greater effectiveness and resilience in our professional lives. As CTTC faculty Brad Kammer says, the intent is that this program will help us not only become more effective therapists, but also love our work more. Please visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com and secure your spot in the 2026 Space Program. Thanks to Rig for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.